plants. However, you don't need to know very much about plants for the AP exam. And the stuff that you do need to know is only about plant hormones. However, in order to learn about plant hormones, you need to know a little bit about plants. And so for the first couple days here, you guys are going to be reading about plant hormones, but I'm going to be talking about just like general plant structures and adaptations and stuff like that so that you can understand how the mechanisms behind these hormones work. So today we're going to start with adaptations of land plants. And the first thing that we need to know is, where did land plants come from? And pretty much the undisputed answer to that is land plants came from aquatic plants. Aquatic plants evolved first, and then land plants evolved after that. And it probably had something to do with the fact that there were ponds, shallow ponds, and these ponds would evaporate, and as they would evaporate, it would expose the plants to short periods of no water. And the plants that could survive those short periods of not having water would be more likely to pass on their genes to the next generation. And then over time, as these ponds began to evaporate and then refill and evaporate and refill, there began to be plants that had enough adaptations, enough selective pressures on them so that they could begin to move away from the pond. And when they moved away from the pond, that was a really big deal, because then they didn't have to compete, and there was also significantly less predators, less things to eat them when they moved away from the pond. So we can say that shallow ponds would often evaporate, causing selective pressure for plants that could survive without water. Now, obviously, they can't survive without water completely. What we're talking about here is surviving without water for short periods of time. Okay, so let's talk about those adaptations that would have helped them be able to survive. So in order to do this, let's think about problems that would arise. What's the first problem that arises from not having water all around you? What's the first thing that they have to be able to do? Well, sure, but they can. Water doesn't necessarily. Yeah, they have to prevent dehydration, right? So that's step one: prevent dehydration. Plants must prevent dehydration. Okay, so how do the water plants, the aquatic plants, how do they prevent dehydration? They live in the water, right? So there's not a lot of dehydration going on because they can just constantly absorb water. Okay, but land plants, they don't have that that luxury. So the land plants have to keep all the water that they're able to absorb, and the way that they do that is they're covered with this waxy substance called a cuticle, and that waxy substance is actually airtight and watertight. So land plants are covered in a waxy coating called a cuticle. That is airtight and watertight. Okay? What's next? Where do these plants get their water from? These ones? The ones that are in the water? The water's all around them, right? But when the water's not around you, where do you get water from? Soil, right? So they have to be able to obtain water. Obtain groundwater. So they got roots. That's step one. It's not the whole thing though, right? So they can get the water into their roots, but this plant up here that's in the water, if this cell that's at the very tip needs some water, it's just going to absorb directly to there. What about if it absorbs the water down here, right, in the roots? How does it get the water to that cell that's in the end? Yeah, they've got like vascular tissue, right? So vascular tissue allows for water transport. Okay. What else? What else is a problem? Think about going to the beach, right? And let's say you're walking along the beach and you see some seaweed. What does the seaweed look like on the beach? It's shriveled up, right? It's all in a pile. It's dry a lot, right? So we talked about the dryness, but it's also all shriveled up and just sort of laying there. That's because it doesn't have any structure. It doesn't have any rigidity. The only reason that seaweed stands up in the water is because it's buoyant, right? And so you take the water away and it all just kind of falls down on itself. And so land plants have to be able to support themselves. They have to have a rigid structure. And so there's this compound that's called lignin, and lignin is going to take normal cellulose compounds and make them rigid, right? We call this lignified tissue. Lignified cellulose provides a rigid structure. Okay, what else? So now they're standing tall. They can prevent dehydration, and they can obtain groundwater. What else about the beach? What do you notice from laying on the sand to getting in the water? What's the big difference? Can you lay on the sand all day on the beach? You get really hot, right? Plants are going to get really hot. They have to be able to control their temperature, right? Prevent overheating, okay? We've talked about this before when we talked about how plants tend to be green, but algae can be black, right? So why is that significant for this? What's happening there with black algae versus green plants? Doesn't need more heat. It's got more pigment so that it can absorb more sunlight so that it can go through photosynthesis because the water is going to cause some diffraction of the light. But on land, right, plants are getting the full brunt of the sun, right? And so they need to be able to reflect more light in order to prevent absorbing too much energy and preventing getting too hot, right? So land plants have fewer pigments to reflect more light. The other thing that plants do is that they can cool themselves through evaporative cooling. They basically can sweat like we do, right? So land plants cool through evaporative cooling, which in plants we call transpiration. It's the process of water evaporating out of the leaves. And this is why, if you have ever been out on our turf field, right, in the summertime, you know that if you put your hand down on it, you're going to burn your hand, right? The turf gets to be like 150 degrees or something ridiculous like that, right? But if you go into a normal like grass field and you put your hand on the ground, it's not going to be 150 degrees, right? It's going to be nice and cool. The question is, if the turf looks just like grass, it's the same color and the same conditions, why does the turf get so hot and grass doesn't? And the answer to that is evaporative cooling, that the grass is constantly allowing water to transpire out of it, and because it's allowing water to transpire out of it, that cools it down significantly to the point where it feels cool to the touch. Okay? But this creates a problem, right? We've got evaporative cooling, which is transpiration, so they have to be able to evaporate water away. But we said the very first thing, the very first adaptation, was that they're covered in a waxy cuticle that's watertight. Right? Anybody remember from Unit 2 how they can balance this watertight waxy cuticle with being able to have water evaporate?
Opening and closing of stomata.
They've got those stomata thing, the tiny mouths, right? And so as they open the stomata, that allows for evaporation to occur, and as they close them, that prevents further evaporation, right? So we can say that opening, closing stomata will control water loss. Also helps with gas exchange, we know that. Last thing is something you might not think about, and that is these plants have to be able to reproduce. And aquatic plants reproduce via sperm and egg. Plants must be able to reproduce. So in an aquatic plant, like this guy up here, sperm is released from one plant and it swims over to the next plant and then fertilizes the egg, right? Take away the water, can sperm fly? No. So land plants have to have an adaptation that gives them flying sperm, and they do. Pollen contains the male gamete, which is sperm, and can be transferred via wind or pollinators. Sperm is a gamete. It's just like one of the sex cells. So you get sperm and egg, and then sperm and egg combine and make a zygote, right?
Oh, okay.
Right. Right? So these are the land plant adaptations. Some land plants have all of them. Some land plants don't. Okay, so let's talk about the types of land plants real quick. The simplest land plants are called bryophytes. The word phyte means plant, by the way. Bryophytes are mosses and this other type of plant called a hornwort. And they have no vascular tissue, no pollen, no roots, and no lignified tissue. Okay, so now we can start thinking about mosses, and we can sort of see why mosses are found where they're found. Where would you find mosses for the most part? Now keep in mind, before you answer this question, that Spanish moss is not a moss. It's a poor name for it. It's actually a flowering plant. Yeah.
On rocks.
You find them on rocks. Where? Do they grow on the top of rocks in a sunny area?
Where it's like wet.
Wet? Wet areas that are generally shaded, and they'll often grow on the undersides of them, right? So, based on this, we can see exactly why, right? They don't have any vascular tissue. Oh, what's the other thing about mosses? Do they grow to be really tall? No, they're like super short, right? So no vascular tissue. That means that any cell in a moss that needs to obtain water or minerals needs to get it by itself. It can't be transferred from other places, okay? No lignified tissue, so they can't grow up big and tall because they'll droop over because they don't have any ability to have a rigid structure. They have no roots, right? Which means that water has to be readily available to all of them, so they grow in moist areas. And no pollen. They still reproduce via sperm and egg, and therefore the sperm has to be able to swim through water, and that's why they're often found in damp areas, so that the sperm can swim from one area to the next, right? All right, let's talk about ferns. They're called pteridophytes. Ferns are often called seedless vascular plants. They have no pollen. They don't produce seeds. The way that they disperse is via their spore stage. And so when we talk about like alternation of generations, the thing with like the sporophytes and the gametophytes and stuff, the sporophyte here is going to be the important part. The sporophyte is going to disperse the spores, and the gametophytes are smaller. Okay, they have the rest of the things there, but you can tell that you are still likely to find ferns in damp areas where there's lots and lots of water because they don't have pollen, which means they're still reproducing via sperm, and the sperm then has to be able to swim through some water source. Gymnosperms. These are conifers, cone-bearing plants. They have all the adaptations. Okay, so as these plants got more and more of the adaptations, they could move further and further away from water. Moving further and further away from water was beneficial to them because it would reduce competition, and it would also reduce predation. It would reduce the amount of organisms that would eat them, because the only organisms that were really eating them had to stay near water, and if they could get away from the water, then they could get away from those organisms, right? Last ones are called angiosperms. So the flowering plants. And those have all the adaptations plus flowers. So flowers are a mechanism in order to disperse the pollen, right? To get pollinators, animals, to come up to that plant and actually get the pollen on them and then move it to a different spot, right? And conifers, because they don't have flowers, they are going to rely on wind for the most part for the dispersion of the pollen, whereas angiosperms, flowering plants, rely on animals in order to do that, right? Okay, anybody have any questions on this stuff, on adaptations, before we move on? Yeah.
Which ones would like fruit?
Fruit-bearing trees are all angiosperms. Fruits are the result of flowering, right? And so they flower first and then they fruit. Okay, let's talk about vascular tissue, because this is one of those things that you absolutely have to understand. In order to understand the mechanisms of plant hormones, you have to understand how the vascular tissue allows for things to be moved throughout a plant. Okay, there's two types of vascular tissue. There's xylem and there's phloem. Today we're just going to talk about xylem, and then tomorrow we'll talk about phloem. Xylem is the vascular tissue that moves water and minerals from the roots to the shoots, right? So up a tree. From the roots to the shoots. Only moves up. Xylem cannot move things down a plant, right? It's made of two types of cells. There's a type of cells that are called tracheids. Those are the smaller type. And there's a type that are called vessel elements. And those are larger. Okay. One of the really interesting things about xylem is that these cells, the tracheids and the vessel elements, they'll grow, and when they're alive, they don't do anything. It's not until they're dead that they start accomplishing their task, right? So they die at maturity. And must die to perform its function. So, looks something like this. Here is living xylem. Living xylem does nothing, right? Just grows. Okay, when it dies, however, it dissolves the cell walls that are in between, right? And it has a thick cell wall on the outside. And so it just gets these little notches in it almost, where the cell walls used to be. Something like that. That's dead xylem. And now we've got a nice little hollow tube of cells, right? We've got cell wall on the outside and no cell walls on the inside. This hollow tube works like a straw, right? So the next thing we got to talk about is how does a straw work? So here's a cup. And it's got a straw in it. And the question becomes, I think you guys all know how to make a straw function, I hope. But how are you doing it? What's actually happening? Yeah.
Pressure is higher on the outside, and
How do you make the pressure higher on the outside?
Lower the pressure on the inside.
Yeah, you lower the pressure in your mouth. How do you lower the pressure in your mouth? Well, when you're sucking in, what you're actually doing is closing off your mouth and pulling air into your lungs, right? That's what's actually going on in your body is you're pulling air into your lungs, which makes a vacuum or a partial vacuum in your mouth, right? Which lowers the pressure in your mouth. And you happen to have pressure outside here called atmospheric pressure pushing down. And the atmospheric pressure pushes down, which forces the water up into the straw into your mouth, right? That's how it works. So low pressure in your mouth causes water to flow up the straw. Right? That's just like something that water does. Water always flows from an area of high concentration or high pressure to low pressure, right? Okay. Then we are faced with another problem, though. We know how a cup works. We know how a straw works. Here's a tree with roots and stuff. We can create suction by moving air into our lungs. How does a tree create suction? Because a tree needs to be able to move water up the xylem. So how does a tree create suction? It doesn't release air, it releases water. It goes through transpiration. It releases water out of the top here. And the transpiration creates an area of low pressure. So just like the straw, low pressure is created at the top. That low pressure pulls water up the xylem, right? So that it can replace the water that's evaporated. But it seems stupid, right? Because water's evaporating and then you're just replacing the water that's evaporating. What good does that do the plant? We talked about cooling, right? That's one of the things that it does. But it's not just for cooling. What else is happening when water evaporates away and then new water replaces it? What do you think? Yep. So you're absorbing nutrients from the soil, right? And then those nutrients are being transported to the top of the tree with this water, right? And as the water evaporates away, do nutrients evaporate away? No, right? So you're just continually transporting more and more nutrients up the tree, okay? There's a problem with this, though. There was an awesome science show when I was a kid called Mr. Wizard, right? And I remember very vividly this episode of Mr. Wizard where Mr. Wizard tries to suck water up a straw from the ground to the third floor of his building. He has like a really long straw, and he wants to suck up. He's got like a big bucket of water, and he wants to suck water all the way up to the top. And you can't do it, right? And the reason why you can't do it is because when you get to a certain vacuum in the top, the water begins to boil, right? Because when you reduce the atmospheric pressure enough, then the vapor pressure of the water causes the water to boil, okay? It's like 33 feet that you can get it up, right? But are trees ever taller than 33 feet? Yes. So how does a tree taller than 33 feet prevent the water from boiling? And the answer to that is interesting. It's that there's no voids in here, right? So we would think that the least amount of pressure that you could have, the least amount of air pressure you could have is like 0, right? That's like no atmospheric pressure at all. It turns out you can actually achieve negative pressures if you have a column that is completely filled with water, right? So if there were to be any voids in this, if this thing were to have a space at the top, then that vascular tissue would be no longer useful. But because it's airtight, or it's airtight all the way up, it's just a column of water, you can continually move water up almost an infinite amount of space, right? That's one way. That's one of the mechanisms that drives this. Let's talk about the other mechanism that drives this. So these are, let's do mechanisms in the xylem. First one we just talked about is called transpiration pull. Okay, transpiration pull means that the low pressure that's created by transpiration is going to pull water up from the roots. So low pressure areas created by transpiration pull water up from the roots. That's not all. There's another way. There's another mechanism at work here. It's called root pressure. Okay, root pressure is going to push the water. It's going to force the water up the tree by creating an area of high pressure in the roots, right? And this area of high pressure is created through osmosis, through what's called osmotic pressure. And we know that osmosis is always going to have water move from an area of low solute concentration into an area of high solute concentration, right? So we can say that osmotic pressure is created due to lower solute concentration in the soil than the roots. Okay, in other words, a higher solute concentration in the roots is going to cause water to flow in through osmosis. As water flows in, that's going to create an area of higher pressure, which is going to push water up the tree. So you've got transpiration pull, pulling water out of the tree, pulling water up, and you've got root pressure pushing water in. Okay, these two forces combined are going to allow for a significant amount of water to be moved throughout a plant at any given point. Okay, this, I think we've talked about it earlier in the year, but this is why the Romans would salt the earth of their enemies, right? They would, put salt on the ground in the fields and stuff, and that would prevent plants from growing there. And the reason why it would prevent plants from growing there is because root pressure is dependent on the interior solute concentration of the plant being greater than the solute concentration in the soil. And if you increase the solute concentration in the soil, instead of having water forcing itself into the plant, water forces its way out of the plant, which then dehydrates the plant and prevents it from being able to grow, right? And for the Romans, that was good because that meant that these areas that they had conquered wouldn't be able to be prosperous without having trade with the Roman Empire, and then that assured that they wouldn't act up because the Romans could then provide them with food so they wouldn't starve. Yeah?
Is that when Bayshore floods and all the plants die?
It's one of the reasons why all the plants die when Bayshore floods, yeah. The other reason is if it floods for a long enough period of time, they can drown. When the root system goes completely underwater, they're not meant for that. They're not designed for that. Anybody have any questions on either of these things? We got one last thing to do, one last little bit to cover here. These two mechanisms are described like this. psi is equal to ICRT, right? And this is a confusing equation, right? Because it uses some weird terminology for different things. Psi, you've probably never seen the psi symbol before in an equation, or maybe you have, I don't know. But it stands for water potential. Water potential is the combination of two things. It's pressure potential plus osmotic potential. And that's helpful because you can see that the two mechanisms at work here are pressure potential, transpiration pull, and osmotic potential, root pressure, right? So the way that you calculate this is by using I, which stands for the number of ions in the solution. So this is going to help you with osmotic potential, times C, which is the concentration of solutes, R is the ideal gas constant, and T is temperature. My very first year teaching AP Bio, I did not teach this formula, and it was on the exam as one of the FRQs, and all it said was, consider the equation psi is equal to ICRT, define each variable, and say how it relates to plants. That was the entire question, and I had never talked about it, so my kids, of course, said psi is equal to, I can't remember this, ICRT, which is actually really helpful for remembering the equation, right? I can't remember this, ICRT. So as long as you know what the things are after that, then you can translate it into something useful. We have questions on that? Yeah.
The transpiration pull, or wait, no, the root pressure. So the osmotic pressure is there's like a high solute concentration in the soil.
No, high solute concentration in the plant.
In the plant.
And low solute concentration in the soil. So the water wants to flow into the high solute concentration to dilute it.